I'm just recovering from a COVID case. I tested negative this morning, but I just want Jennifer to be extra cautious here. The Neighborhoods Committee welcomes you this evening to this program about the Ballard locks. As many of you know, this is part of a series of 3 things we're doing about the Ballard locks. Tonight, to remind ourselves about the history, and then on August 10th, some of us are going out to the Ballard locks and having a tour of the inner workings of the locks, as well as the fish ladder and the beautiful gardens. And then on August 17th, a cruise on the Argosy, an Argosy cruise through the locks. So we'll get to experience some of what you described for us. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer is a friend here in terms of making presentations at Horizon House. This is at least the 4th time she's spoken on behalf of the Neighborhoods Committee. Jennifer is an environmental historian with a particular interest in Seattle's history of moving dirt, rerouting waterways, and leveling hills. It's a good city to live in if that's your interest. She is the Assistant Director of History Link and has contributed numerous articles to the online encyclopedia, and has also written for the Seattle Magazine and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. She is the author of Olmsted in Seattle, Creating a Park System for the Modern City, the general editor and contributor to Seattle of 150, that's stories of the city through 150 objects from the Seattle Municipal Archives. And then, most pertinent for tonight's program, the co-author of Waterway, the story of Seattle's locks and ship canal, which she wrote with David B. Williams. So, Jennifer, it is our pleasure to have you here in person. Thank you for your, we've been saying this to everybody who comes. So many of these programs have been scheduled and rescheduled, and it's so nice that you all stay with it with us and come to be with us. So we're excited to hear you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really good to be back, although I have definitely still getting my sea legs back with being in person. It's like, oh, you're all in 3D again. And I'm no longer just talking to my bookcase, and which is very, very nice. I'm really happy to be back here and appreciate you having me. I first want to thank David. I think you all know him. And just to acknowledge that this is the first book I wrote, and I was so lucky to be paired with David on this. He's a remarkable writer and researcher, and he's the only person I've ever met that I can send him the random maps and little factoids that I find, and he gets as excited as I do about them. So, okay, so I'm going to give you a tour of the history of the locks, and I'm really excited that you get to go visit, because there's nothing quite like the locks in Washington, or even, I think, in the United States. If you compare us to other locks, ours are particularly great and interesting. Oops, this moves. And so glad you get to go see that. And so I will jump right in. So one of the questions that we thought of when we were working on this project is that, why would they build a ship canal? We are a city covered with water, surrounded by water. Why did we need to build another waterway? And I'm gonna have to wear my glasses. The one thing that's changed since last time I was here, I can't see anymore. The landscape here was incredibly rich with resources. Right? We have trees, we have fish, we have coal, we have incredible farmlands. But in order to get any sort of economic gain from that, you have to be able to get it to the water, because there aren't many ways, particularly in the early years, of getting it across the United States. You had to get it to the ships, and also looking westward to Asia, you want to get it to the ships so it can be traded with Asia. And when you think about the interior, and then you have that giant row of hills that are blocking the way between Lake Washington and the waterfront, you have to think about, so how are they going to get around those? Because they can't go over them with a railroad, or even really with wagons, when they're relying on horsepower. And so they have 2 options that are existing. Okay. just so that one I forgot. And the first one is the Duwamish River Valley. So you can get from Lake Washington at that time via the Black River that came south from the lake, and then hooked up with the Duwamish River and came out to Elliott Bay. That one was difficulty because the tidal influence led to a lot of shoaling, and so it was very hard to have a reliable route through a fairly shallow river to get cargo, if you're thinking of more heavily laden vessels. And so that was not really a great option. The other is this cleft in the hills, if you think of all our north-south hills, and then there's that odd little break between Lake Washington and the saltwater, just north of Capitol Hill and just north of Queen Anne. David and I have debated this. Being not a geologist, I want to say that clearly it was the meltwater that created our other valleys, must have created that cleft also. But he, being a geologist and very clear about what evidence you need, says that it's not proven at all. But still, there was some sort of natural influence created that cleft. And so that was one possibility, but it was not a thoroughfare yet. There were two portages that had to be done between Salmon Bay and Lake Union and Lake Washington. And so they knew it would require quite a bit of engineering, but they knew it would be worth it, because if they could open up that route, they could add 100 miles of shoreline to the harbor, which when you think of Elliott Bay and even the Duwamish River, that flat area, they knew they would do the waterway at some point there. That's not that much land. If you want to build a city that's built on industry, there's not that much level land in Seattle, particularly at that time before the fill of the tide flats. And so it's a real benefit to add just space. The other benefit is that it provides freshwater moorage, which has a lot of benefits. You have no shipworms and ripples, the things that undid our seawall. The tidal action, it's so you don't have to account for the raising and lowering of the ships when they're at the docks. And then also, it's just protected. It's a very nice protected area. Elliott Bay is a really great bay. It's protected from our southwesterly winds, but it's still open seawater, and so it would be an added protection to have that fresh water. And the third reason they wanted to build it, and this would come later, was that it would provide, they thought, flood control for the South King County, North Pierce County area. It didn't, but they hoped it would. We'll get to that later. And so the settlers that were coming here were looking at a space that had long been used by Native people. That passageway between freshwater and saltwater at the where the locks are today, where the ship canal is, was part of the canoe highway, and that's what we call that way of moving around the region in the canoes. Because if you go over land, you either have the hillsides full of forests or the valleys full of marshy land. There's very few areas where it's very easy to traverse overland here. And so indigenous people took to the waterways, and they had canoes for all different conditions. And they looked at the chain of connections as were not an issue for to have the portages, because they could stow or cache their canoes, walk over, pick up other canoes, and continue on their journey. Or they could portage the canoes if they needed to. And so what you end up seeing is right along this route are several village sites for the Lakes Duwamish people. And the first one, number one there, is brush spread across the water is what it was known, and that's West Point that we know today. And then at number two, right at the site of where the locks is today, was Shul, which was the tucked away inside. So that's, they tucked the little village in there on the inside of the bay. Still a saltwater bay at that point on the inside of what's today the locks. And then the third sort of primary village in there was at what we know today as Ravenna, and that was Little Canoe Channel. And that was one that was a fairly substantial village, and it was connected by waterways up to Green Lake and then over to Licton Springs, which has just recently been designated a landmark for its traditional uses. And so you have the Lakes Duwamish people, which are related to the Duwamish people that are on the Duwamish River. Their primary villages are around Renton and on Elliott Bay. And so you see Renton down toward the mouth of the river and then on Elliott Bay. They're completely interconnected. The sort of tribal designations that we have all learned are largely a product of the treaty era, and so it's more useful to think of them as interconnected family connections, differentiated by which waterway or which watershed they lived upon. And so we also see an influence and a connection to the Snoqualmie people today, the tribes that make up the Tulalip tribes, the Snoqualmie and Snohomish, and then the Suquamish, because they do not have in their traditional territories lakes or substantial rivers. And so they were frequent visitors to this side of Puget Sound in order to access the interior resources on the freshwater. And of course, they're all interconnected, they're trading, they're marrying, they're family. And so the village sites were places of a little bit of power because you're right there on that pathway through. And also the place where people are stopping and visiting, so your trade networks are very extensive. And before I go on, sorry, I'm going to say one thing about this. So the other thing that's really important about this cleft in the hills is that it doesn't just open up the freshwater, it also opens up the routes north and south. So if you think of going into Lake Washington, you can go down to Renton and connect with the Black River. I say Renton, the south end of the lake. And then you can also go through Lake Sammamish and then go north or south from there and go up to the Snoqualmie River drainage and onto Skykomish in that area. Or you can go south to Issaquah and go up and around to the Cascade Passes. So you have this real nexus. Seattle is very much at the center of quite a trade and transportation network. So in 1854, just 3 short years after Seattle is established by the Denny Party, Thomas Mercer has a claim up at the south end of Lake Union, and he has the whole town out, very, very small number of people at that time, who come for a picnic, and he gives a big speech, and he names Lake Washington, and he names Lake Union. And I always had associated that that might be somehow related to the sectional strife of that era in the 1850s in the run-up to the war. No. He saw it as Lake Union was going to be the connector that brought together the saltwater and the freshwater. And so as early as 1854, he watched the native people using it in this way, he saw the potential of it, and he called out for the lake to be the connecting piece in this ship canal. But in true Seattle fashion, it would take them 63 years to build it. For all the same reasons that it takes forever today. So Mercer and others in Seattle are looking at ways to build the city. And one of the first ways is to mine coal and get it to San Francisco, because San Francisco is going gangbusters. All the steamers that are appearing on the Northwest Waters need coal. But the coal is in the foothills and the port is in Seattle, and so they have to figure out how to get it to Seattle. They can't go the Duwamish River route because it's too heavy. It will get grounded on the shore, and so instead they take it through the Mount Lake Portage and over through Lake Union, down to a tramway, over to Pike Street. There's a bunker, and that's where they drop it on the ships. They have to handle it 11 times in that time, so it's incredibly inefficient. But the poor fellow that tried to get the first load of coal down the Duwamish River, it took him 2 weeks. So that was a no-go also. They really didn't have any choices. They did not have the capital or the working power to build a railroad at that point. That was not really an option. So they went and made do because it was worth it. Coal was worth a lot of money at that time. The other resource that we have at the time is lumber. And again, I read this really great quote recently, is that no one within 500 miles of Seattle needed lumber. Right there, trees everywhere. So if you want to make money off of lumber, you've got to get it out of the region. And California is where they're building, and they need to get the lumber there. But how do you get it from the lakes to the shoreline where all the sawmills are? Because at this point in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, all the sawmills are on Elliott Bay. And so they're trying to figure that out, and so they dig a ditch, as only 19th century Seattleites would do. you just dig ditches and you rework things. And they, this is looking westward at the Montlake Cut, the Montlake Ditch, which is where, or was where 520 is today. So that same right-of-way, that's why it was available for the freeway, because it was originally supposed to be the route of the canal. And they put wooden locks at the downstream end. They would load all the logs in the bay right there at Union Bay. They would keep the locks closed, let the water build up, and then they would open the locks and the logs would shoot through one at a time. And then they would, or a couple at a time, and then they would take them down to the south end of Lake Union or through another log ditch that was through where now the Fremont Cut is. And so that was the way that they figured it out. In the 1880s, this was the best way to move logs through the region, was to float them. And so there's not enough capital, there are not enough people here, there's not enough industry here yet. And so the Seattleites turned to the federal government as the possible developers of the ship canal idea. And several Army Corps of Engineers, and I've lost track of where he was, but we have a former Army Corps of Engineer person here. They had something called boards of engineers, and they would come and they would assess a problem and they would assess the cost of resolving the problem and then decide if it was worth it or not, and if it was even technically feasible. And so they came to Seattle in 1867 and they look at several routes. They look at Lake Union to Salmon Bay, which would have meant that they would come out of the Fremont Cut and they would take a sharp left south through Inner Bay to get to Elliott Bay and the ships. They looked at Mercer's Farm, which was that farm I was just talking about where Thomas Mercer had his homestead. They looked at cutting straight across there. Remember, Denny Hill is just south of this. They're kind of looking at going through the saddle between Queen Anne and Denny Hill. They rejected this one because it was a lot of dirt that would have to be moved. Like if you think about the drop from the bluff at Pike Place Market down to the water and how much dirt would be involved. They rejected the Inner Bay one because it would be hard to protect if anybody attacked Puget Sound. If there was an enemy attack, it was kind of hard to defend. And they also wanted to save that space for potential railroad use. The eventual railroad yard that went in there was foreseen quite some time. They looked at the tramway route. That's that coal railroad that went from the south end of Lake Union, went around the east side of Denny Hill, and then cut straight down Pike to the bunker. Again, same problem, way too much elevation change and way too much dirt to move. They looked at the Duwamish River. They thought, could we make that work? Could we dig it, make it into a strong enough channel, armor the sides, deal with whatever sort of movement from the tidal action? And they decided it was too long. It was just too long of a distance. And so they essentially settled that the best route would be the one that we ended up with. But it took a very long time and lots of arguing. Seattle wasn't, the boards of engineers basically looked at the problem and said that yes, it's feasible to fix it, but there just aren't enough people here and there's not enough commerce. It's not going to pay for itself, particularly with the upkeep that would be involved in building a canal. And so they said no to the idea. And Seattle kept going back to the federal government. The federal government kept saying no. And in the meantime, everyone started arguing about how to do it, where to do it, who should do it. And the federal government basically decided that they were squabbling too much. Why would Congress invest in something that the people that live there can't even decide how it should be done? And so they just kind of put their hands up. The election of 1892 brought it to a statewide audience, and everyone in the state was arguing about how much should be invested in Seattle's infrastructure. A lot of the same argument you hear today is like Seattleites were saying, invest in Seattle, the whole state will benefit. And a lot of people in the rest of the state were saying, no, we have our own projects that need money. We're not going to just hand it over to Seattle. And so the Dig the Ditch candidate, McGraw, won the election of 1892, but the federal government still wasn't convinced. And so while that is all going on, there is an effort afoot by Eugene Semple, who is the former territorial governor and he is also the person who was on the Harbor Lines Commission, who helped decide where the inner and outer harbor lines would be in Elliott Bay. And he came back and he thought, I could build a canal through Beacon Hill. And David and I were absolutely convinced when we heard about this that it was a sham, that it was a cover for doing whatever else he wanted to do, make money, build land, whatever. We didn't think he could possibly have meant to dig a canal through Beacon Hill over to where Columbia City is today. It would have been several hundred feet deep. And it's kind of crazy. It's a lot crazy. And so we read through all of his reports, all of his correspondence. I think he was just one of those optimists, that territorial and early statehood era that we can do it. Engineers can figure it out. He had a whole plan, and he got people to support him. They were just so desperate for action to take place that they funded him. They subscribed to his company, the Seattle and Lake Washington Waterway Company, and he actually got quite a ways. This is the havoc he wreaked. He was able to dig the east and west waterways that we still use today. That land created Harbor Island, the dredgings. He also created a ton of acreage at the base of Beacon Hill because he was sluicing the hillside down into in order to dig the canal, he was drawing the dirt down into Elliott Bay and using it to fill. Unfortunately, he ran out of money a lot in that boom bust cycle of the economy at the time, and the people who supported the federal canal at the north end of town actively worked against him. And so they eventually called out the city for supporting his efforts by giving him free access to city water. This is right after the city water system is developed, and so there's an abundance of water, and they let him use it with his hydraulic sluicing, hydraulic giants. And so they let him do that, and that's eventually how they got him to stop. But I love this one quote I found in the Seattle Republican by Horace Caton, who was the editor. He says, there is no more probability of the South Canal ever being put through so that ships can pass through it than there is of Puget Sound being drained for a farm. So some people saw the writing on the wall. And so eventually they stopped him. He kept going all the way, filling the tidelands, using the same legal mechanisms that allowed him to do this. He kept going all the way until the month before the locks opened in 1917. It was pretty amazing. He just kept building up land, and he would sell it, and then he would get enough money to keep going. He's a very optimistic person. And so the cleft in the hill that we're looking at here that he sluiced is, you can still enjoy this. When you come up Columbian Way from the West Seattle Freeway, that ditch in the hillside that makes it possible to have a roadway there, that's Semple's work. So it looks a little better today than it did then, although a little more concrete. So by 1904, 1905, things are pretty much in disarray. The federal government won't invest. Semple's pretty much out of business. No one has enough money to build the North Canal on their own. And so Hiram Chittenden rode to the savior of Seattle. And he was just coincidentally a brigadier general brought in to serve as the district engineer for Seattle. It was just one of those lucky coincidences. They didn't send him to Seattle because this was his specialty. He was just really the right person at the right time. And so what happened is that just as Semple was being shut down in 1904, the city votes to give James Moore of the Moore Theater and also that housing development, he got a contract for $500,000 to build a single lock at Salmon Bay, and it would be wooden, and it would just function, right? It would just get boats in and out and create this start of ship canal, and then it would build from there. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And Chittenden saw that when he came to town, and he was terrified because he knew whatever Seattle built, the federal government would have to deal with. They would have to operate it because it's a navigable waterway, it would fall to the federal government. He did not want a wooden locks, and he did not want this single lock contraption. He wanted it to be far more elaborate. And so he starts to put together a new plan, and he does it at the same time that he's developing a plan for the rivers in the South King County, North Pierce County. Right at that time, there was a big debate, lots of court cases going on, because a big storm, depending on who you believe, a big storm or a big dynamite explosion had rerouted the White River from King County to Pierce County. It's just such a small divide that they could do that. And Pierce County did not want the White River because they did not want the flooding that would be caused. And so they said, you have to take your river back. And King County said, no, act of nature, we don't have to take it back, it's your problem. And because they want flooding to be reduced in the Green River Valley. And so they do that, and they go to court, and basically they hand it off to the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, to figure out the solution. And so Chittenden realizes that if they do a whole sequence of things, it will solve the problems for the whole region, he hopes. So what he decides is that the White River will stay connected to the Puyallup River, but there will be major investments in opening up that channel and making it so it can carry more volume of water. In the Green Duwamish River Valley, that will be reduced, the water there will be reduced both by the White River being removed, but also when they build the locks and the ship canal, forward one, they will put 2 locks in. They will put one at the Narrows and one at Montlake Portage. And what that means is that Lake Washington will be lowered to the level of Lake Union. I'm sorry, they will put 1 lock in at Salmon Bay and just a cut through at Montlake Portage. Sorry about that. And so they will lower Lake Washington to the level of Lake Union, and they will raise Salmon Bay to the level of Lake Union. So they're doing 2 things at once there. The entire thing becomes a body of fresh water instead of salt and fresh. And so what that will do is it will lower Lake Washington by about 9 feet, which means the outlet at the back of Black River will dry up. And so that means a whole nother river will not go into the Green Duwamish system, thereby reducing flooding. Unfortunately, this all came to pass, but it didn't work. It wasn't until the Howard Hanson Dam was built and the Mud Mountain Dam, those 2 were built in the 60s, that you really get flood control in the Green Duwamish River Valley. And so it's interesting that we basically replumbed an entire watershed. It became the Cedar Sammamish watershed instead of the Cedar, Green, White, Duwamish. And we wouldn't do it today, but it's an interesting exercise in how do you make all of these waterways work for you, because the additional benefit is that the water from the Cedar River that's now going into Lake Washington provides enough water for the locks to operate. Without that input of water, there wouldn't be enough water. It's already pretty tenuous right now there. On dry years, they are very careful about how much they use the large locks. And so Chittenden put all of this together, wrote a report, convinced the Secretary of Defense to approve it, and finally in 1911, we get the approval of the Secretary of Defense to go ahead and build this, and the Army Corps of Engineers will build it and operate it, and it will be concrete, not dirt. Or not, I'm sorry, not timber. So in preparation and in hope that all of this will go through, in 1909 you see the first construction on the ship canal. This is the Montlake Cut in 1913, but work was begun on it as soon as the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition closed in 1909. They closed in October and it just started right up with the hydraulic giants. They leave 2 coffer dams at either end of the cut, so they're keeping Lake Union and Lake Washington separate while the rest of the project is developed. But it's all ready to go very early on. They're optimistic folk. And then in 1911, you see the Fremont Cut started. And I love this picture because it shows you the first bucket of dirt being lifted out of the Fremont Cut. And it shows you just how invested the community was in the construction of the ship canal. We often think of it as an engineering project, but it really was a community effort. The reason that people were arguing so much about it is that it meant the world to the city, the possibility and the potential for its development. And so you see everybody in there Sunday best celebrating that first bucket of dirt here. Construction of the locks begins as soon as the Secretary of Defense, or I'm sorry, it's probably the Secretary of Army at that time, but today's Secretary of Defense, approves it. And it's pretty clever how they do it. There's still tidal water moving through the area. So what they do is they build first this cofferdam that you can see here. It's that dirt dike that is going around. That protects where the large locks and small locks are being built. And once that is done, they leave the gates open and they turn the cofferdam and build it the other way, southbound, in a C shape. And that's when they build the dam, the water control dam that's there today that leads over to where the fish ladder is. And they also built the fish ladder at the time. And what I am particularly interested in when I tour the locks, and you'll have to ask them to show you, is in the machine shop, there are still the molds. They made every part of the locks here on site except for the big gates, the big doors, which are here, those giant doors. They brought those in pieces. They were forged, I think, in Pennsylvania. But everything else, there's a mold, there's instructions. They can replace any part of the locks with the tools and materials that they have in those machine shops. And you can look in the window today when you're touring. It's very cool. And so this was my first time through the locks. I had never ridden a boat through it when we were doing the research for this book. So David and I climbed down during the clean out and walked through the locks. It was pretty amazing. And then I crawled back out because I'm not big for it. It's amazingly deep how big it is. And so in August 1916, you have the first step in opening the entire ship canal for use. And that is the opening of the cofferdam at Montlake. And I love this picture because OSHA would be horrified, right? This is a different era. And there's a whole series of pictures where you can see everybody running out of the way of the water. No one was hurt. And so they first opened the Lake Union side and they let the water equalize with Lake Union, and then they opened the Lake Washington side. And the poor contractor that had the contract for this, they kept having the sides sloughed in. And so that's why it's armored with cement today, is that they just could not keep it. They had to try 3 times to get it filled with water and not having the sides slough in. And then in July 1916, they let the first boats through into between Shoal Bay and Salmon Bay, which is now a freshwater bay. And it's pretty interesting because early on in the process, the arguing is all over how are we going to get coal and lumber out. The first cargo through the locks in October of 1916 is coal and lumber, but they're coming in because it took them so long to build it that the mines here had been largely displaced by the mines in northern Vancouver Island, which had a higher quality of coal. And then the lumber had been cut, and there were railroads in place for the lumber that hadn't been cut. And so really they were just bringing logs in from around Puget Sound to the Salmon Bay mills, because of course they had already developed in the interim. And so it was immediately a success with the cargo passing through. On July 4th, 1917, they did the official grand opening. That's the one that we commemorated in 2017. And they had a big boat parade, and it was extremely popular. You can see all the people watching. It's also interesting to see how stark that landscape is. It had not been beautified, and we'll see various stages of the beautification as we go along. Right away, along with the benefits of the ship canal, we get the consequences of the ship canal that we are still dealing with today. One is that, of course, the Black River dried up, and it literally dried up in a day. As soon as the lake dropped, the water went away, the fish were flopping. The Moses family, the Duwamish family who lived, they had retained, even after the treaty era, they had retained their ownership of land. They watched the fish, and they watched the settlers scooping up the fish and celebrating their great luck, and with great sadness. And it also was a loss of this incredibly beautiful river that you can see up there on the left. It was a lovely river that people just enjoyed. It was a place that we all as a community loved, and it was completely gone. It's now filled, except for one small ditch by Fort Dent Park. If you go down there, you can, when you're on the Sounder, you can look down and see the last little bit of the Black River. Another consequence that we're still kind of trying to figure out is that this is Lake Washington Boulevard before the lake is lowered. It's on pilings in the places where the lake shore is inconvenient for the road. They sort of cut across some spaces. And you'll notice all that brush and growth there underneath. That's all wetlands. And we lost about 1,000 acres of wetlands around the entire lake. And the other issue that we're having today that affects not only the environmental health of the lake, but also the cultural uses of the plant materials and the animals, is that we keep the lake high in the summer and low in the winter, which is the opposite of the natural cycle of the water, because think rains in the winter. And the reason they do that is because they don't want it to become overflow during the winter rains and all that, but they want to make sure they have enough water for operating the locks, and so they keep it as high as possible all summer so they can ensure they can operate the locks. So it doesn't work well for the native plants that have traditionally been collected along the river and provided habitat along the lake. But right away, the Ship Canal becomes the working waterfront. It's an extension of the downtown waterfront, and they didn't get the steel mill that they hoped to get at Kirkland, and they didn't get the entire shoreline of Lake Washington. In 1896, the first time a boulevard is proposed for the shore of Lake Washington, the state legislature just shrieks in horror that they would envision anything other than industrial uses for the west side of Lake Washington. But again, it took so long for the process to unfold that the residential uses come down all the way to the lake, and Olmsted is able to get in there in 1903 and plan an entire boulevard system. And so that entire space on the west side of the lake never becomes industrial. And there was a large shipyard, but other than that, you never get that industrial development because of residential and agricultural development that takes its place. One of the interesting things about the Ship Canal is it still serves its purpose today, that the building materials that build the city that are incredibly inefficient for shipping, that you can't put in trucks, it's too expensive, they can come in via barge very inexpensively. And also, less so now, but I live in Ballard, and so for a while there it was sort of gangbusters. Everything was being built and torn down. And imagine a city where you have to put all of the gravel and all the asphalt and all those types of materials into trucks and move them on city streets. It would be a very different experience as far as like how we would manage our traffic system. And so this is true. This is one of the few uses that is still sort of impacted by changes to the rest of the city and the use of our waterways. One change that when I first started giving this talk, and I'm still sad about this is the Fishing Vessel Owners Marine Ways, which is a very long name for a sort of a repair shop, sort of a fix anything on your ship. And it was at the Fisherman's Terminal just below the Ballard Bridge if you're heading south, just on the right. It was a cooperative business, and it was part of a whole network of repair shops on the Ship Canal. You can get anything fixed, still today. FEO is just recently closed down, sadly. But you can still get a lot of work done on various marine engines and vessels on the Ship Canal. And it created sort of that economy of scale that you can get, efficiency of scale that you can get with everything close together. Fisherman's Terminal was built. It was actually opened in 1914 before the Ship Canal was fully developed. They just dug a channel through Salmon Bay to get the fishing boats in and out. But that's another one where you get that efficiency of scale, is that you have all these shared resources that are subsidized by the port, allows the Alaska fishing fleet to have a place to port. And before that, there were so few places to dock your fishing vessel that they often would just beach them for the off season. And when they opened Fisherman's Terminal in 1914, there was a parade of vessels all the way from Tacoma. It was a regional celebration, which is fairly unusual at this time. There's usually a lot of competition, but everyone was so happy that this facility was going to be available. On Lake Washington, this is the Anderson Shipbuilding Company that would build those large ocean-going vessels. The Ship Canal is built and designed to handle ocean-going sailing vessels and steamships. And so all the way through World War II, they built large ships and small ships at the shipyard in Kirkland. After the war, and with the opening of the Lake Washington Floating Bridge in 1940 and the increased suburbanization, the city of Kirkland decided they did not want to be an industrial town, and they essentially pushed the shipyard out by rezoning, and it's now a lovely waterfront, but there is no shipbuilding there. It was a little notorious for bad behavior. Apparently, during World War II, there's quite a bit of lunchtime drinking, and there were several instances where workers got welded into the hulls of ships because they fell asleep while they were working and nobody knew they were in there. And there were other issues. So it was not doing very well generally. And then other things on the shoreline where there was some sawmills. The last one closed in 2004, where the Seahawks facility is today. And then there was a creosote ship, there was a whaling station on Maidenbower Bay, so there were, and then Sandpoint, of course, and Boeing, although neither of those were very ship canal dependent, but it was never as was envisioned by the early planners. What happened instead is that after World War II, you just see this massive transformation in who's using the waterway. And in the 1920s, you get the first pleasure boats on the lakes. And there's a really great Seattle Times article where the writer is like, I did not expect that there would become this great market of pleasure boats on Lake Union, but this is great. And so you get all of these different small boat manufacturers, you get the Lake Union dry dock, you get the moorages, and then of course all the repair shops and that sort of thing. And so by the post-war era, those recreational vehicle vessels start dominating the ship canal. The numbers change significantly, and this is back on here. By 1990, we have 20,000 commercial vessels going through locks, but 60,000 recreational vehicles. And there's still nearly 2 million tons of cargo. That's that Alaska connection. A lot of barges are going up to Alaska from Salmon Bay, still true today. But really, you're just seeing a tremendous outweighing of the recreational vehicles, recreational vessels. And so in the 50s, you also see a shift in land use. Prior to the war, it's when you're reading through documents, it's like everyone's elbowing each other for a little bit of space on the Lake Union shoreline or Salmon Bay so they can just get to the water and do their commerce. After the war, you start to see people saying, hey, the waterway is not just a facility, it's an asset. It's a recreational asset for the community. And so you start to see street ends that are set aside as public access, and you see efforts to rezone. Although the argument was made then that's still made today is that once you have made this massive environmental impact, then you should consider carefully before you give up that space to recreational uses, because then that commercial businesses will work elsewhere and do further environmental damage somewhere else. And so it's an interesting balance. We get Gasworks Park because there's really not much else to do with the gasworks after they close, but you also still have Lake Union Dry Dock on the South Shore. And but another thing, I'm not sure if anyone here would have ever met Betty Miller. Anybody meet Betty Miller? She was a force of energy for the Seattle Garden Club, and in 1958, she's the person the Miller Library is named for, the Center for Urban Horticulture. She decided that to lead an effort to beautify the ship canal, because she saw all those recreational vessels, that it could become repeating. People would come here not just for services, but also for pleasure, that it would become a destination. So she worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Parks Department, 3 railroads, and all of the private business owners along the Fremont Cut, and developed those trees that are so beautiful now, the poplars. She's the reason we have that. And they were still active railroads. She got them to agree to let them plant trees there. They would go on, the Seattle Garden Club, to develop the Montlake Cut. And when you think of like those boardwalks where you can walk and there's the nice benches, that's all Seattle Garden Club, just really looking at the ship canal as an amenity, not just a facility. So those are all the nuts and bolts parts of the locks, but the locks is also incredible fun. Every time we had meetings there while we were writing the book, something would happen and we would have to stop everything and go look at what was coming through the locks. And this was one that I just couldn't believe when I saw this picture. It's 1975, and this is a dry dock, the White Sands floating dry dock. And the Lake Union Dry Dock Company wanted to use it as part of their facilities. And so they looked at how to get it into the lake from out in the saltwater. And the engineers got together and decided that yes, they could tilt it at high tide and slide it through. So they did. It didn't really slide, it inched. But they had a very short window of opportunity because they had to do it at the highest possible tide and before the tide started going down. And so they laid down on their bellies and watched to see that it wouldn't take out any of the facilities on the sides of the lock. And it's still in place. You can go down to South Lake Union and still see the White Sands in use of the ship canal. That's just one. This week somebody just sent me a picture of a B-29 that was going through the locks on a barge, which makes no sense. So of course we had to figure out why. And it's because it had crash landed in Puget Sound, but they wanted to bring it back to Boeing, and so they put it on a barge. And the wings go right over the sides of the locks. They had to again wait for high tide and go through at that time. So one of the sort of side notes, but it's still a really significant community asset, is the Carl and Edith English Gardens, which you'll get to tour. And it's an amazing story that more recently federal facilities are beautified and made as public recreational facilities, but very early on, Carl was hired to beautify the locks. It was a destination. There's always been an attraction of watching the locks and watching people go through. And so he's really interesting that the two of them, you'll get to see their greenhouses when you tour that they worked with, but he didn't like more formal gardens. There's a mix of native species and specimen gardens, or specimen plants, and he did an interview in 1938 with the Seattle Times, and he said he had filled it with more than 700 varieties of alpine plants, about half of them native to the Northwest, the rest obtained through international exchanges. So that was one of his expertise, is that he and Edith were really good at swapping plant material all across the world, and that's why we have such an incredible variety in the gardens there. So I'll finish with this image, almost finished. This is one of the pontoons for the new 520 bridge going through the locks in 2017, and it's a good reminder that the locks are historic and amazing, but they are not a relic. They are still very much an important part of our regional transportation infrastructure, and also a part of our community in the sense that people have a very personal connection to the locks. One of my favorite things about doing this book was hearing all the stories, often drunken boating stories from the 50s and 60s, before that was more frowned upon. The number of people that tied up incorrectly and ended up sideways in the locks is pretty amazing. But it's really hard to imagine Seattle without the locks. You can think of other cities that have waterways that don't have the locks. It's just something that makes us unique. It is something that is particularly beautiful to watch and is important to our economy. And so I'm really excited you all get to go out there to visit. And so I'll just end with a little plug. Waterway, unfortunately, is going to be out of print shortly. We are still trying to figure out if we can do a reprint. It is so expensive these days to do book printing, so we're still trying to figure that out, but it's available in all the local libraries. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But also go to historylink.org. We have a lot of content about the ship canal and the life of the lakes since its construction, and it's really fun to check out. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to see you. I'm going to wait for the microphone to get. There's one person back in the...
Thank you very much for that lovely story, but I didn't quite understand the dry dock part of it. This landed dry dock. Could you explain what they were doing and how they got it through?
Sure. Repeat the question. So he's asking about exactly how did that work with the dry dock going through in 1974. So the dry dock was out in saltwater. They want to get it into fresh water, and it was too wide to just go through the locks. And so they waited until the highest tide, and then they used like inflatables, like not inner tubes, but essentially like airbags, and they got it up on an angle. And so then they could slide it through without taking out all the infrastructure along the edges. That was the key. And they could only do it at the highest tide because as soon as the water started going down, it would have just dragged right across the walls of the ship canal. So, does that make more sense? It's pretty crazy. Yeah.
There were people lying in their stomachs doing what?
He said people lying on
It
their
would
stomach.
make it lying on their stomachs looking for what?
They were looking to make sure, so along the walls of the locks, there is various infrastructure for the actual operation of the locks. And so they were making sure that it was going to clear the wall and not take out any of that infrastructure. And I'm not sure what they would have done had it started to drag. Maybe yelled. They sort of, once they committed, they were in for the count. But yes, they were all very nervous. Anyone else?
Well, since the Panama Canal had to be widened, do you ever see that possibility happening here?
So he's asking if, since the Panama Canal had to be enlarged for the Super Panamax or Super Post Panamax ships, would that ever happen here? Highly unlikely. We have a different infrastructure for the locks itself is like an iceberg. The part that you see at the top is a mere fraction of the massive amount of concrete that's underneath. One of the things we thought when we started the research is that earthquakes would be their biggest fear, right? That would be the most catastrophic thing that could happen. Not at all. They're not worried about that. They have systems in place. They're much more worried about things breaking and not working because it is such a massive structure. But that also makes it very hard to imagine enlarging it. Also, the amount of water that is used for each locking is so enormous that during drought years, they don't even use the large lock. They can only use the small lock. And so if they were to enlarge it, they would need more water. And with the more refined environmental sensitivities that we have now, we wouldn't do that because it would take too much water from the fish. So yeah, no, that's the one lucky thing, I guess, about it being primarily recreational vehicles, or I keep saying that, recreational vessels today. Any question? I think
I'm curious because you both have worked on the Duwamish and how much the locks impact the Duwamish. How do you balance justifying one in favor of the other? Or how do you think about that?
How do I think about justifying that? Well, one part of me, it's not justifiable, right? The environmental and cultural consequences of how we've reworked our water systems are not justifiable. But the realist in me and the city dweller who benefits from these waterways all of the time, I think that the way that we can reconcile it is taking every opportunity that we have to mitigate the impact, both to the environment and also to the people. And so, and to acknowledge, during the commemoration of the centennial, there was a lot of discussion about the battle days and the Army Corps of Engineers making horrible decisions and doing horrible things. And somewhat true, but also important to remember that literally the city operates because of that today. And so we could choose anytime to undo, to a degree, the work that was done and restore these waterways and restore the environment. But the consequences would be enormous, the economic consequences. And so that's where I think it falls to, you know, both community, social responsibility and individual responsibility to mitigate the impacts as much as possible. So not a perfect answer, but that's sort of how I reconcile it.
This is a little tangential, but I understand that when they lowered the lake, the river ended. But where was the Cedar River? Did that always flow into Lake Washington? Or how did that, I'm not quite sure how that changed.
It's confusing because it both flowed into the lake and into the river. So Lake Washington is in a trough, and the rise of land that separates it is very shallow or very low. And so a strange configuration of rivers developed. You have the Cedar River comes out of the Cascades, goes through Renton, and then used to take a little jog north and then a jog west and end up in the Black River. Except for when river levels were high and the Black River was running slow, the Cedar River would flow into Lake Washington. And so it was not a big feat of imagination to imagine just shifting it over, and it's not that much space. It's a very small space that we're talking about, less than a quarter of a mile. And then, so they just rerouted it and then closed up the Black. It also solved, that's one place where it very much solved a flooding problem. Renton was constantly being flooded prior to this. And when they moved it into Lake Washington, it solved that problem.
Are you still having an issue with the sea lion and the salmon? Can you hear me?
No. Yeah, I can repeat it. She was asking about the issue between the sea lions and the salmon, which I used to find pretty amusing because if no one's aware, in the 80s and 90s, Herschel the sea lion came to the locks and realized it was a smorgasbord, and then he went and got his friends from California because they tried to deport him back to California. He then brought his friends back, and they were all, it was just gluttony, right? If you remember the pictures, they would bite the heads and fling the bodies. And unfortunately, and they did all sorts of things to try and get rid of them. They blew up firecrackers, which then deafened them. They played loud music before they deafened them. They put in a floating orca whale to try and scare them away. And they penned them, they moved them, they tried everything. And originally I did think it was very funny. I remember Herschel, and I remember everybody kind of chuckling at the Corps of Engineers trying to sort it out. What I've learned since, however, is that Herschel and his fellows really did decimate the steelhead population. And it never has recovered. And so it's something that they're still working on. For various reasons, there are not the same problems with the sea lions. And I have never figured out if the tribes were called in. They are the only entity that are allowed to kill marine mammals. And so, because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so there was talk of that. It was never, as far as I'm aware, documented, which I can understand why they would do that on the down low. And so, I mean, it's the same thing that's happening at the Bonneville Dam. It's, you know, once you have concentrations and it becomes easy picking for the predators, it's pretty hard to protect the prey species. So, but right now, the sea lions are not as harmful as they have been in the past. Looks like that's it. Well, thank you very much. Again, it's nice to meet you all.